Hi listeners, I'm your host Camila Pintos Lopez and this is Eternal Stories. This podcast series is brought to you by Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries New South Wales. For more information about the cemeteries and the work they do, feel free to visit their website at www.smcnsw.org.au. We'd like to begin this episode by acknowledging the Bidjigal people of La Perouse from the Eora Nation, traditional custodians of the land, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. If you've had a chance to listen to our episode 0, you've already had a snapshot of what's in store for the series overall, and I can't wait to jump into some of these really important individual topics and stories in more detail. But I'm someone who likes to start at the very beginning. So our next 2 episodes will be about the history of each cemetery, some interesting facts you might not have known, and how they came to be the memorial parks we know today. Starting with Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park, or for short, ESMP. ESMP, located in Matraville, Sydney, is actually composed of 2 previous cemeteries, Botany Cemetery and Bunurong Cemetery, with a bit of a complicated history. I'm going to take you back 140 years to 1881, when the development of Botany Cemetery began. Talks about the development of Botany Cemetery are recorded as early as January of 1881, with discussions taking place at the Legislative Assembly about the need for a new cemetery site in the city. Ideally, they wanted a location out of the way of the city's water supply. This discussion was in tandem with a proposal for an extension of the already existing tramway line to Waterloo and Botany. The newly founded Botany Progress Association was pushing for a general cemetery to be built in their district, and on the 22nd of December 1885, the first meeting of the BPA was held, with an open invitation to any respectable resident of the district. A man hailing from Glasgow, Scotland, named James J. McFadden, was the honorary secretary of the BPA. He arrived in Sydney in 1878 and is considered one of the pioneers for the development of Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park, and would later become Botany's first mayor in 1888. The government of the time had its own ideas about where a cemetery might best fit within the developing city we know as modern Sydney today, with a suggestion for the site to be at Bumbora Point Road in Botany. However, the BPA wasn't too fond of this idea, deeming the suggested site unsuitable and offering an alternative location at the corners of Bunurong and La Perouse or Military Roads. The initial discussions were slow, but in early 1887, McFadden reported that the Minister for Lands had promised approval for the BPA's proposed site, and months later, the BPA had begun campaigning for a road to the cemetery site. By this point, the tram line to Botany had existed for 5 years, and the terminal was located near the Botany Bay Hotel, which still stands today. However, the landscape of Sydney back in the late 1800s was vastly different to how we know it to be today, with roads still in development and carriages considered the main form of private transportation. This way of life posed problems for even the initial stages of development for the cemetery. A walk from the tram terminus to the cemetery was the only possibility, as a viable road did not exist, and the walk itself was easily 2.6 kilometres, or a 30-minute trek. This made it highly inaccessible for not only those wanting to bury or visit their loved ones, but also those responsible for transporting the coffins to the burial site to begin with. McFadden urged for an extension of Botany Road to the location of the new cemetery along the beach. However, this was knocked back because the proposed line cut across private lands. It wasn't until the 10th of January 1888 that the dedication of the General Cemetery at Botany was gazetted. At the time, the General Cemetery was an area the size of a little over 2 acres and was considered extremely isolated, with only one maintained road in its vicinity. In July of the same year, the BPA was officially dissolved, after several members had become aldermen or council members of the newly established borough of Botany, the same borough McFadden was now mayor of. More than a year would pass before a deputation for the various churches in the Botany area would approach the Minister for Works, asking the land dedicated for the cemetery be fenced off for the purposes of burial. But it wasn't until August of 1890 that the land had been fenced in, and even then, scrub that adjoined the fence externally had not been cleared to reduce the risk of fire. The Botany Cemetery wouldn't see its long-requested road until January of 1892, 5 years after initial campaigns by the now dissolved BPA began. And even then, the section running through the cemetery was considered impassable, meaning burials were still not able to take place. The road section from the tram terminus was consistently blocked by sandstorms or water, depending on the season, and when this issue was raised to the government, the response was no more funding would be available to amend the issue. However, at some point the roads must have been fixed because by August of 1893, the cemetery was ready for its first interment. At the time Botany Cemetery officially became a working burial site, it had been laid out in different sections, according to religious denomination. The Church of England received the largest section of 5 acres, the Roman Catholic Church followed with 4 acres, the Presbyterian Church was given 3 acres, Wesleyan churches received 3 acres, and the Congregational Church 1 acre. A Jewish section existed in those days, but was the smallest, with less than an acre provided. A further general section of the cemetery for those not belonging to any of the denominations was also available, with a size of 2 acres. After 5 years of tireless efforts, Botany Cemetery would lay to rest Emily Cox in the Church of England section of the cemetery on the 21st of August, 1893. She was just 24 years of age. But it wouldn't be until the following year that other burials would begin to take place in other sections. Mary Wiggins, wife of Botany Progress Association activist Alderman Joshua Wiggins, would be the first to be buried in the Presbyterian section, and John Birch would be the first interment in the Roman Catholic section. On the 21st of November 1897, 92-year-old John Short from North Botany would be the first burial in the Congregational section, and a little over 6 months later, Mary Ann Stockton would be the first interment in the Wesleyan section on the 6th of June, 1898. So you might be wondering, when does Bunurong Cemetery come into this story, and why? Well, after 8 years of Botany Cemetery officially operating, in 1901 the government established Bunurong Cemetery as an all-purpose built cemetery for the remains from the old Devonshire Street Cemetery to be transferred. Not many people may know that the old Devonshire Street Cemetery was knocked down to make way for what we know to be Sydney Central Station. By the time the decision had been made to build Central Station, Old Devonshire Street Cemetery had been operating for over 50 years, having been consecrated in 1820, but it was deemed to be in the way of the new railway station and was consequently closed. The idea to move graves and headstones to a new cemetery site had already been done before, when the old burial grounds on George Street were closed to make way for the build of Sydney Town Hall. So that's not one, but 2 pretty big landmarks in Sydney today that actually used to be cemeteries. Notable figures already relocated from the old burial grounds included Thomas Reeby, John William Lewin, and members of the Underwood family. Devonshire Street Cemetery also housed some First Fleeters such as brewer James Squire, merchants Samuel Terry and Simon Lord, and Sydney's first postmaster, Isaac Nichols. Devonshire Street Cemetery had officially been closed for new burials in 1867 due to overcrowding, and Haslam's Creek in Rookwood had been built as a solution to this issue. However, the maintenance to Haslam's Creek had been somewhat neglected, and plans to resume burials at Devonshire Street were once again in talks by the late 1800s, and officially resumed the same year it closed for the build of Central Station. It is estimated that around 8,500 remains, including monuments, were removed and transferred to other cemeteries by relatives of the deceased. Burials that were left unclaimed, approximately 30,000, were moved to the new cemetery at Bunurong. Bunurong Cemetery was located immediately adjoining the east of Botany Cemetery, on a site of about 30 acres of sandy swamp surrounding the lake. This land was cleared and drained, but the lake remained and carp were placed within. A new tram line was constructed from the Botany terminus to the cemetery in order to transport the coffins from Devonshire Street to their new destination, each accurately numbered in accordance with their relevant tombstone. This tram line was part of a new circular route which went through Long Bay, Maroubra, Little Bay, the Coast Hospital, which had its own cemetery for the sick, La Perouse, and the northern shore of Botany Bay. The tram motor with 2 wagons made 2 to 3 trips a day between Devonshire Street Cemetery and the new site, loading coffins, tombstones, and ironwork. The line also managed to transport around 2 million bricks, used for the construction of the new penitentiary at Little Bay, as a way of cutting down on government expenditure. At the same time, the tram provided a seaside trip and access for people taking up land in the newly developed subdivisions of the area. By the 11th of August 1902, the La Perouse tramline transitioned into a passenger-only mode of transport, no longer serving as a funeral tram transporting coffins. Interestingly, Bunurong Cemetery underwent a few name changes initially. The Board of Trustees referred to itself as the La Perouse Cemetery Trust. The Department of Public Works referred to the site as Botany New Cemetery. The Department of Lands called it the General Cemetery at Botany, Bunurong, and was only later referred to as Bunurong Cemetery. By June 1901, some headstones had begun the trip to Bunurong, even though at this stage the tram line hadn't been completed at the city end. Whilst headstones were being transported, some human remains had begun being exhumed, placed in coffins, and stored in a shed, before finally being moved to the new site. At the time, families had 7 days' notice prior to exhumation, so they could be present on the day of removal. By August of that year, it was reported that around 80 burials were being exhumed per day, and over 1,700 coffins had already been relocated. There were some delays due to coffins being made of lead and requiring several men to complete the removals. It had initially been suggested that the new graves be cemented, but due to cost restrictions, they were pressed with sand instead. As much space could allow, families were placed together at their new location with their original headstones. This is why certain headstones at ESMP predate the existence of the cemetery. The graves of unclaimed remains were placed on either side of the family burials. However, it appears that certain remains may not have made it to their final resting place in Bunurong. Recent excavations undertaken in 2019 as a part of the Sydney Metro project unearthed the box remains of an individual with a small name plaque indicating they were that of a man named Joseph Thompson, whilst his gravestone was already relocated at Bunurong. It has not yet been clarified if his remains are an isolated incident or if others had also been left behind at the old site of Devonshire Street Cemetery. On the 7th of January 1902, it was reported that work of relocation had been completed, and approximately double the space had been allocated for the project than what was needed, meaning that leftover land was available for landscaping to beautify the site. This included the plantation of flower beds, shrubbery, and ornamental trees. It was initially decided that no new burials would take place at Bunurong Cemetery, and a caretaker was appointed to the grounds, with some expectation that the site would attract revenue from visitors once the flora was in bloom. However, the Bunurong Cemetery Trust was unable to generate profit, and the relationship with the neighbouring Botany Cemetery was quickly souring. There were ongoing disputes regarding access to Botany Cemetery due to the design of the tramline appearing to favour access to Bunurong only. Many people visiting Botany Cemetery chose to walk from the tram stop located at Bunurong, instead walking along Military Road to the main entrance. This road was in considerably bad shape at this point. Undertakers would need to take hearses along at a full gallop in order to avoid getting stuck. Others chose to stop along Bunurong Road and have pallbearers carry coffins from there to Botany Cemetery. Both solutions caused further problems. Various requests from Botany Cemetery to gain access through Bunurong were denied by the trustees of Bunurong Cemetery. Finally, the Minister for Lands intervened to allow for a funeral procession to pass through Bunurong Cemetery at the request of the Botany trustees. In response, the Bunurong Cemetery trustees resigned en masse in September of 1917. This subsequently led to the amalgamation of the two cemeteries, with both under administration of the Botany Cemetery Trust officially by the 4th of July 1921. However, even though both cemeteries were now under the one trust, meetings were still separate and minutes were recorded in different books. Upgrades to the roads were undertaken immediately and new road sections were laid within the Church of England and Catholic sections, finally allowing for full access to hearses. It was agreed in January of 1923 that female restrooms should be built on the grounds. Further building developments were made, including a waiting room at the entrance that sheltered visitors from the elements when necessary. A small room was also erected for clergy to wash and robe in, and an on-site workshop was built for stonemasons. Since the relocation project from Devonshire Street Cemetery had taken place, the discussion of cremation as an alternative to burial had increased, even though the concept was still fairly new in Australia, and as of 1902, no official cremation had taken place. Legislation to regulate cremation had been passed in South Australia in December of 1892, but no crematorium would be built for another 10 years, and even then, no operations of it would occur until 1903, on the 4th of May. It would be decades before New South Wales built its first crematorium, located at Rookwood in 1925. Close to a decade later, talks began for one to be built at Botany Cemetery, in large part due to the shortage of available lands for burials. In fact, it was estimated that the cemetery would be full by 1953 if interments were to continue at the normal rate. Local Member of Parliament Robert J. Heffron successfully lobbied the Department of Lands in 1936 to grant the Botany Cemetery Trust an additional area of land for the purposes of building a crematorium and further interments. Barbed wire fence was also implemented to replace paling fences that had been vandalised by campers from nearby shanty towns, who had used the fencing to build huts. By 1937, construction for the crematorium was underway and was based on overseas examples. The plans provided for the provision of 2 chapels, a columbarium for the housing of urns, a cremating chamber, colonnades, offices, and waiting rooms for mourners. The building was surrounded by gardens and lawns, and parking spaces were available. Robert J. Heffron, MLA, would open the crematorium in an official opening ceremony held on the 8th of May 1938. At the time, cremations averaged out to be about 1 per day, and the ashes were either taken by the relatives within 24 hours, or if kept by the cemetery, they would be placed in a columbarium niche within the wall of remembrance with a plaque, or scattered over the gardens, in the sea, or to the four winds of heaven. Above-ground vaults were the next major development at the cemetery, taking place during the 1950s. The vaults were designed to accommodate for 12 sets of remains, as opposed to 4 in a double grave. Whilst above-ground vaults had existed for some time already, they were considered to be an expensive choice, and only really available for wealthy families. The Arena family was the first to construct an above-ground vault at Botany Cemetery, with 1 to 2 built on average every year until the end of the decade, and all belonging to families of non-Anglo-Saxon origin. Despite the development of the crematorium by the 1960s, the Trust was still under considerable pressure to find space for further burials. Portions of denominations that had space were reallocated as a solution, including the reallocation of 250 graves from the Methodist portion to the Roman Catholic section, and around the same amount from the Congregational to the Church of England. An unused strip of land within the Bunurong Cemetery was also transformed to a general section. As a further solution, with the aim of making cremation more desirable, the Eastern Suburbs Crematorium Society was formed in 1962, offering financially attractive packages to local residents. The Trust also investigated the possibility of digging more space for burial plots in the rocky portions of the Roman Catholic section. This decision led to the mass resignation of gravediggers, and led to the unprecedented use of jackhammers and compressors to dig graves. In 1965, and following the demolition of the dilapidated caretaker's cottage, a kiosk was added near the main entrance and was leased to the wife of the resident supervisor of the crematorium, Mrs. Moncrief, who used it as a tea room and a flower shop. Just 2 years later, lawn cemetery sections would be established with small uniformed headstones, providing space for 360 additional graves, considered a comparatively low-maintenance alternative to the traditional large marble gravestones. By 1975, the Greek Orthodox lawn cemetery section was opened, allowing for special headstones featuring a sheltered niche where candles, crosses, or other special mementos could be placed within. The final cemetery amalgamation took place between the years of 1968 and 1972, beginning with the passing of legislation to have Bunurong Cemetery operate for new burials, instead of remaining as its originally intended purpose as a relocation site for Devonshire Street Cemetery. In 1972, Botany and Bunurong cemeteries transformed into Botany General Cemetery and marked the development of Pioneer Memorial Park. The idea for Pioneer Park was included within the legislation, with the idea being for the Trust to preserve graves deemed to be of historical significance as a collective and have them located in a specified memorial area. In September of that year, legislation abolished all separate denominational trusts that had existed for close to a century and made the executive the actual trust. 7 organisations were then given the task of nominating one person to sit at the Botany Cemetery Trust, including the Sydney Diocese of the Church of England, the Archdiocese of the Roman Catholic Church, the New South Wales Conference of the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church in New South Wales, the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, and the local member of the Legislative Assembly as the representative for the general section of the cemetery. These same trustees also form the Eastern Suburbs Cremation Trust. The trustees soon began talks with the Royal Australia Historical Society, or RAHS for short, about the development of Pioneer Park. Keith Johnson and Malcolm Sainty, both volunteers, historians, and genealogists, spent over 200 hours over the course of 3 years, recording all inscriptions of the Devonshire Street monuments at Bunurong. Johnson was subsequently tasked by the Trust and the Historic Cemeteries Committee of the RAHS with marking all monuments recommended for preservation with a dot of white paint. Architect Milton Wittig's sketch plan of the park was approved by 1973, with further plans for a pavilion within the setting drawn up by April of 1974. However, in February of 1975, the Trust suddenly changed course and began tenders for the removal of headstones, namely in the Presbyterian section of Bunurong, with no established plan for where these headstones would be relocated. Eventually, it was decided that legible headstones would be placed in a temporary holding bay on Frost Street, and the illegible ones would be disposed of, despite the concern this caused historians and descendants of the memorialised graves. By September of 1975, the Honorary Treasurer of the Trust, F.W. Reid, presented his own plan for approval, in which the select headstones would be arranged in a diamond shape around a central memorial, the Blake family tomb. The rest of the headstones would be arranged in straight rows forming a rectangular shape and affixed to concrete plinths. The proposed arrangement didn't consider denominations or chronological order and was approved by the Trust, with the work undertaken in large part by the cemetery's own staff. Unsuccessful attempts were made to open the park during the Royal Tour of 1977, but instead was quietly marked with an afternoon tea and plaque unveiling on the 23rd of September 1978, honouring F.W. Reid, who had reached statutory retirement that year. Another attempt was made for an official opening on the 19th of October 1980, but it wouldn't be until 1987 that a booklet, Pioneer Memorial Park, was published by the Kate Banks Family History Group, which included a list of retained headstones and their inscriptions. The publication noted that of the 2,285 headstones transferred to Bunurong from Devonshire Street, just 746 had survived to become Pioneer Park. In the 1980s, the development of the Eastern Suburbs Memorial Grove was underway, with crypts and vaults erected after land previously owned by Borrell was given back to the cemetery. In 1997, an opening ceremony was held to mark the occasion, with the burial grounds consecrated by His Eminence Cardinal Clancy and His Eminence Archbishop Stylianos. Further developments have occurred within the last decade under management of Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries, with a total of 480 new crypts and vaults added. 2,000 memorial placement positions were also added within the Glade section and open to all denominations. A mausoleum was added in 2016 and is known as the Ascension of Jesus Christ Mausoleum. It contains 610 crypt spaces, 1,021 niche spaces, and a central chapel that can seat 180 people. Sydney sculptor Linda Clarfeld designed a series of 15 cast bronze works, including the floating sculpture of the Ascending Christ. David Jack designed the mosaic tiled vaulted ceiling, and Annie Story from Canberra was commissioned to design 2 floral water sculptures out of recycled copper, one placed in the contemplative courtyard and the other situated in the building interior. That same year, the Garden of Innocence was opened, adjacent to the Garden of Loving Memories, as a specific memorial for children. During the opening ceremony on the 29th of April 2016, the remains of an unknown baby girl found in Maroubra in 2014 and later named Lily Grace were laid to rest within. Other memorials now exist within ESMP, including the New South Wales Police Memorial to commemorate officers killed in the line of duty, the First Fleeters Memorial, naming every person who arrived on one of the 11 ships on the First Fleet and according to the ship on which they arrived in Australia. The ESMP Military Memorial, which was opened in 2016, and the Stolen Generations Wall, opened in 2017. To date, it's estimated that 65,000 people have been laid to rest within Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park. Other notable memorials within ESMP also include the rugby league great Herbert Henry Daly Messenger, who had already been buried at Botany Cemetery in 1959, and Arthur Stace, otherwise known as Mr. Eternity, who was interred at Botany 52 years prior to the memorial addition in 2019. But don't worry, I wouldn't leave you with just a mere mention. We'll be getting into further detail about these 2 famous men in later episodes of this series. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Eternal Stories on the history of Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park. On our next episode, we'll be taking a walk down memory lane at our other cemetery, Warrenora Memorial Park. For more information on this episode and the podcast, feel free to head to our Facebook pages under Warrenora Memorial Park and Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park, or on LinkedIn at Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries New South Wales. Our website again is www.smcnsw.org.au, and of course, thank you for listening.